All right. Our last class of explanations are institutions, which, okay, the definition of an institution is maybe going to trip people up a bit. But I'm just going to read it what we have here. The humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction consist of both informal constraints and formal rules. We are going to say we're talking about the formal ones, the formal institutions. So these are things like what your constitution is, the type of government. Do you have a dictatorship? Do you have a democracy? How do you organize your educational system? How do your laws work? Do you have rule of law? Do you have contract enforcement? Do you have property rights? Do you have a market economy? Do you have a command and control economy? These are the institutions, okay? And they essentially will provide the incentive structure of the economy, like what is rewarded and what isn't. And so you can easily see how this might shape economic growth, innovation, or it might shape stagnation or even decline. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're going to think about that England had really developed a different set of institutions than that of the rest of the world. That by the onset of the Industrial Revolution, England really has unique and more inclusive institutions than the rest of the world. Specifically, they're going to encourage both saving, investment, and actually in invention. Okay, so our institutions basically, society comes up with them. All right, they're not geographic, and they really set kind of the constraints and they shape all the incentive structure of the economy. So here are our like our classic examples will be the property rights. Like how strong are property rights? Hold on, baby monitor's going off over here. Okay, and we're back. The baby's fine. Don't worry. It's not really a baby. It's a 3-year-old. He's okay. Okay, so we're talking about property rights. Like how strong are the property rights? And can an individual have the property rights, or is like say land? Is it community owned? Like how does that work? How strong are they? Can somebody come and take my land pretty easily if they have like if they're a higher class or something? Democracy. How's the government run? The legal system. Legal systems are very different around the world. Innocent until proven guilty, guilty until proven innocent. Is it a very malleable legal system that can adjust and change, like the common law system, which we have in the U.S. based on the English system, or is it like the French civil code system, which is very like rigid? How easy is it to start a business? Like, what are the different hoops you have to jump through to start a business? Is it can incumbent firms keep other ones out? What are the constraints on political power? Like, how powerful is our executive, whoever's in charge? If it's a king, if it's a president, like, can they do whatever they want, or are there checks and balances? All of these are institutions. Education is another institution here. Like, how do we run our educational system? Who gets access to it? What is the quality? That sort of thing. So these are all institutions. And so first of all, it's like a big umbrella, and you may think, okay, these ones matter, these ones don't matter, these ones are really important, these ones aren't. But broadly, again, the institutional argument will say these are the things that really matter beyond geography, beyond what resources you have, which would again beyond being the geographic one, beyond the cultural. Okay, like if you have say good property rights and a market economy, that will work whether it's in China with that culture or whether it's in Mexico with that different culture. Again, that'll be the institutional argument instead of the cultural argument. Okay, so here's an example. What does this mean? Average protection against risk of expropriation. What does that mean? This is just property rights, okay? How strong are property rights guaranteed? Meaning like, is it easy for somebody to come and take my property away? So risk of expropriation, essentially. Expropriation is somebody taking something away. So over here means strong property rights. And then here is GDP per capita in 1995. This is from an Acemoglu paper, by the way. I should have the source down here. Okay. And as we can see, there's a pretty nice relationship, pretty tight correlation between the two. Places with strong property rights are much richer than places that don't, although obviously there's not a perfect relationship. Here are the constraint on the executive, like what checks and balances are. And again, countries with lots of checks and balances, this is an index, so this is as high as it can go, tend to be richer than those where the executive is free to do with whatever they want. Okay, So if we look at England, as I mentioned, like England had evolved over time to have what we would call inclusive relatively inclusive institutions for the time. Basically, you want to think about it. There's a monarch, and there's a set of elites, um, and the monarch essentially has to bargain with elites if they want to raise taxes or raise money, um, and he has to cede some power, depending on how strong he is. Um, and so essentially what happens in England is there are these feuds between the monarch and the elites keep winning. So the elites keep getting more and more power. And the elites are also made up of merchants. And the merchants like a specific set of institutions. They like access to capital, so the Bank of England. They like, typically, with some exception, they like anti-monopoly. They like free entry into markets, and they like property rights, and they like their freedoms protected. So these merchants and these other elites keep getting more and more power from the monarch. The monarch doesn't like any of these things usually. The monarch likes monopolies because he can get some rents from them. They can pay him basically to be monopolies. They don't really care about access to capital. They don't. They definitely don't like freedoms, and they also don't like property rights. They like to take land when they want. So a monarch is really going to like a set of institutions that are not conducive to growth, where the merchants are going to like institutions that are conducive to growth. And what happens in England is, as I mentioned, the elites keep winning. These little skirmishes between the monarch and the elites just keep winning each of these little battles, getting more and more power, more institutions that they like. And so by the time we get to the 1700s, England has a whole host of institutions that other places don't have, where those merchants, those parliamentary powers have lost out. We want to compare it to Spain. In Spain basically, the monarch doesn't really have to bargain with the elites because that monarch has a bunch of gold coming in from the New World. So it's like I don't need any taxes from you. I don't need any I don't need anything from you. I got gold pouring in from the New World that basically, because I've granted these monopoly rights to certain explorers, they pay me my cut, and I'm rich. I don't need to listen to you. All right. And so, and if we take it further back in the slides, what I'm talking about here is we have the merger of two kingdoms, Aragon and Castile. And Aragon, which is kind of around present day Barcelona, had a system that was more similar to British, with like a vibrant commercial sector with merchants that had power, and there were some parliaments. After these two kingdoms merge, Aragon and Castile, it's really Castile's institutional environment, which is a much more strong monarch that takes over. And as I mentioned, that monarch doesn't really need to bargain with the elites because they have the gold from the New World. And there's also a steady income from the Sheep Herders Guild, the Mesta, which we'll see here. This is the routes of the Mesta. You can still celebrated today. It shows you the persistence of inefficient institution. This is an inefficient institution because the sheep are allowed to graze wherever they want. So it's an abrogation of property rights. They're just allowed to eat on whoever's land they want. And so, with Spain, the monarch is strong, and then when the empire goes into decline, when Spain starts losing their colonies, instead of bargaining with the constituents, Spain, they just go to expropriation. The monarch just starts taking land by force instead of bargaining. And so we get kind of a persistence and exacerbation of these institutions that are not conducive to growth, which is like, if you look at the 1800s, there are these differences between England and Spain, according to the economic historians who are the proponents of this institutional theory of growth. Okay, so the pros of the institutions are you can measure them. There's indexes for how strong property rights are. You can look at if it's democracy. You can look at the constraint on the executive, so you can measure them. You oftentimes have historic measures as well. And so you can quantify it, and you can try to look at their effect. We also, in general, it makes sense. Like if I tell you, hey, institutions matter, like your legal system matters for growth, makes intuitive sense. We also have this very nice example. So this is the Korean Peninsula. This top one is North Korea. The bottom one is South Korea. And so The and then the bright stuff is the night lights. So as I mentioned earlier, you can think of, or not think of, the luminosity, like how lit up a country is a proxy for growth. The more night lights, the more developed a place is. So South Korea, whoa, it's all lit up, super developed. North Korea, not so much. Basically have this one little dot there, which is the capital, but that's about it. It is very undeveloped. And so here you have institutions in practice. In the 1950s, the Koreas, North Korea and South Korea, are essentially the same in terms of development. It's a very poor country, uh, historically pretty poor country. And so they're equally poor in the 50s when the partition happens, when North Korea and South Korea are partitioned. Geographically, they're the same. Geographically, we're all on a peninsula. There's no real difference in resources between North and South. Um, Culturally, same ethnic group, same culture. The only difference is we get a dictatorship up here. We get somewhat of a dictatorship in the South too, but basically we get a command and control communist or socialist economy up here. We get a market economy in the South. Boom, fast forward, market economy with strong property rights, um, market access, all the institutions I talked about earlier. Fast forward 50 or 60 years, South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world. North Korea is one of the poorest. The only difference was the institutional path they chose in the 1950s. So pretty strong case study evidence right there. Now, cons, there is going to be some overlap with culture where it's just hard to figure out why certain institutions emerge and persist. Like, okay, why does democracy, last in some places and it doesn't last in other places? And so there's like a cultural aspect that's real complex that interplays with the institutions. And so sometimes it's hard to disentangle the two. And like I talked about in the China case with geography, it's susceptible to post hoc, where what I mean by that, it's hard to identify. If you see a place that does well, it's hard to identify which institution really mattered. Usually these institutions are bundled together. So the instance here is like, we would look, if I were giving this lecture in 1995, we would look at all the economically successful countries and say, democracy, that was huge. Then China comes along in the past 30 years and puts that on its head. China basically is a totalitarian state that just switched to a market economy in the early 1980s. So they didn't do democracy. They kept being totalitarian, authoritarian regime, but they just switched their economy from command and control, socialism, to market economy, capitalism. Although they still have some socialist elements, but they added a market economy, and then growth took off. So, so basically what I'm saying here is it's hard to untangle which are the specific institutions that matter. Okay, all right. What do you think? What do you think is the most important one? Spoiler for this class, we are going to focus on institutions, which will be the subject of the next lecture.